All right, good morning. I'm Natasha Duarte, the director of the Composting Association of Vermont, and this is one of the sessions for our Soil Builders Education and Action Project, Best Management Practices for Compost-Based Products for Landscape Architects. The Soil Builders workshops were developed to provide compost-related eco-literacy for Lake Champlain Basin decision makers, professionals, and advocates, and to really start helping connect the dots between compost, organic matter, soil health, and water quality. We know that compost increases soil stability, fertility, water infiltration, moisture retention, and that using compost in land management practices can be a critical strategy for adapting to a changing climate. But there's a clear knowledge gap between understanding that there are these benefits and then how do you use compost to produce those benefits? There's also concerns about elevated phosphorus levels in the Lake Champlain Basin, which have contributed to confusion about when and how to use compost. An important piece of addressing this gap, and something that we're going to be talking about today and that we talk about throughout the Soil Builders workshops, is this idea that not all composts are alike. So you really need to know what you need, which material you need for specific applications to achieve the results that you're going for. The Soil Builders program is comprised of a series of different modules geared to help folks gain a deeper understanding of the connections between soil health and water quality, increase technical know-how about compost, including specific compost best management practices for a wide variety of interventions, and then also helping folks learn how to support change of practice for road construction, development projects, landscaping projects, stormwater control, and site remediation. Today's session is one of a series of deeper dives on some of these topics. And as I said, all of the webinars are recorded. They're going to be posted at compostingvermont.org/soilbuilders. And we're also posting related resources there. So as we get into today's session, don't worry too much if Chuck is referencing, or on some slides we reference additional resources. We'll have those listed and linked on the CAV website. And just before we get into today's program, I want to acknowledge my Soil Builder team: Athena Lee Bradley, Mark Companion, Chuck Duprey, Brian Giroux, Deb Nair, and Ellie Ventura. And of course, additional thanks to my board of directors, who's provided review and oversight, as well as guest panelists for a variety of the different modules. I also want to acknowledge and thank the New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Commission and the Lake Champlain Basin Program for their generous funding of this project through an education and outreach grant. And so with that, I'll introduce Chuck, who is our presenter today. Chuck is president of Naturcycle. Naturcycle is a firm focused on the sales and marketing of compost and engineered soils throughout the Northeast. Working with a variety of private and public composters, they provide material for projects and retail use throughout the Northeast, including some of the largest green roof and engineered soil products in this region. Chuck serves on the STA committee of the U.S. Composting Council and consults on beneficial reuse of organics, engineered soil, and stormwater projects around the country. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Chuck.
Thank you very much, Natasha. Appreciate everyone's time today. If we have any landscape architects in particular joining us, I'm going to go over briefly our learning objectives, because we are offering continuing education credits for landscape architects today. So you'll be able to relate the 4 segments of compost use, have a definition for the backfill application and the specification of compost use there, be able to relate a design for a low nutrient compost, and then explain 2 benefits of top dressing with compost. So as we go through this today, our focus for landscape architects and design professionals that are joining us is the best management practices, the most common studied and well-developed uses of composts. Some of the places we've taken that information from are groups like the International Erosion Control Association, the American Association of State and Highway Transportation Officials, AASHTO, if you've heard that term, the U.S. Composting Councils, and other university studies. These are some of the things that we've researched and studied and tailored the solutions to the Lake Champlain Basin area. So here's a look at that. Some of those different participants and places we pull from. So as the soil builders have developed their approach and the Compost Association of Vermont, we really narrowed it to 4 specific areas of compost use that are common and we want to see growth and expansion in. One we won't really focus on today, that's agriculture, but we're going to talk about compost uses in landscaping and athletic fields, what I call direct erosion control practices, where the compost is the stormwater solution directly, not blended or used with soil, and then low nutrient applications. So these top 3 are what we'll focus on as we're going along. Pictured to the right and throughout the presentation are just different examples of compost to kind of show you that there might be some visual differences and particle differences, but these are all well-made compost for different applications. You know, shown on the right is a more erosion control type compost. It's coarser, a bit woodier, more mulch-like, and there's reasons for that we'll explain as we go along. So compost and compost products, as Natasha mentioned at the beginning, not all compost products are created equal. You know, the physical properties of the specific compost, things like particle size, the inputs that go into it, the feedstock materials, what type of aggregated fibers are in there related to its fertility. You know, we're looking at some of these different aspects of it and really should determine its uses based upon that compost analysis. Those are 4 different compost Naturcycle deals with across the bottom, just as an example, but you can see the different colors and textures and where they might fit in is what we're going to talk about throughout this presentation. So just as a brief overview, most states regulate compost through the Department of Agriculture with some sort of labeling process describing, you know, if you're going to sell in the bag potentially or even in bulk, what the characteristics are of that compost, often looking at NPK and different macro and micronutrients that are important to the agronomic application of that compost. Next. But when you're looking at something like a labeling or state requirements, what it really comes down to is some sort of sampling and analysis. What parameters matter in that sample, how they conduct the testing, what background information is important for its use, how does human activity at the end use influence what you're going to choose for a compost, and then how confident you be in the sample results. If you've got a project and you're sampling that compost for it, Composting Council Education Foundation has a great video on how to sample compost materials for anyone that might be interested in that and looking at a material for a job or project if the compost producer isn't providing it. So what Naturcycle and many throughout the country have used as a basis of design is what they call the Seal of Testing Assurance Program. In the late 90s, the U.S. Composting Council, from an EPA grant and a large amount of private funding from groups like Procter and Gamble and Kimberly-Clark, put together a team of scientists and researchers to develop the best testing and measurement parameters for composting and compost uses at the same time. So they didn't really do as much new research as one might think. There's already a wide variety of compost research out there. They compiled a lot of different applications and soil research, and then built what we call the test methods for the evaluation of compost and composting, like ASTMs, if you're familiar with that term, for compost. There's other different ways to assure quality compost and that the material meets the design you're looking for. Things like the Rodale Institute has testing and an acknowledgement program. There's other organic programs out there that might provide guidance, like OMRI or NOFA. And something that's a biosolids-based product usually even has further state regulations that'll test things like metals and pathogens to ensure that further safety and health of use, governed by the state regulators and then even EPA. So there's a variety of different ways to get the compost testing information you might need to develop the uses. We're going to focus on Seal of Testing Assurance because it's so widely used throughout the country. But there are some other labs in the region like UMass that might do some testing, but not nearly as broad as what the STA program and the 11 or 12 labs that participate in that program offer. So we're going to delve now into best management practice, then we'll look back at the specs that meet with it and talk about how those are important to each design and what to look for from a designer standpoint. So compost utilization in landscaping and athletic fields, that first compost segment we're going to focus on today, could be something like mixing soil to revegetate a disturbed site. It could be backfilling around a tree or plant like you see in the picture. They're mixing some of the native soil that was there with some compost to improve it when they plant trees or shrubs or even perennials. Top dressing, if you're not familiar with that term, is where you're spreading a thin layer of compost on top of existing turf or planting beds for the variety of nutrient and agronomic benefits you might get. And then there's even mulching, where compost can be used as a mulch alternative to get slow release nutrients back into the ground and soils and some potential weed suppression. So these are kind of what we'll general uses, and we'll look at a spec now. Well, beyond the one more set of general uses, what you get from the benefits of compost, if you're not familiar, is that compost offers 3 key benefits. And this is what AFCO, the American Association of Plant Food Control Officials, which is the regulators throughout the country that govern fertilizers, things like that, they indicate that there's 3 benefits compost can claim. There's physical benefits, chemical benefits, and biological benefits when used in conjunction with soil. So physically, you improve the soil structure, open it up, add more air. Chemically, you can add those macronutrients we're very common with, like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And then there's biological benefits that they can claim, like restoring that soil biology that's important to plant health. Things like nematodes or different bacteria or fungi. Very useful specifications we're building upon today are what the U.S. Composting Council has to offer on their websites and research-based sites. And then the USGA, the U.S. Golf Association, has a number of useful top dressing and compost-related specs for use of compost on turf. So here's kind of a general landscape specification that is available through the Soil Builders programs on the website. You can take and reuse for yourself. The keys here, if you're going to specify compost in a design project or in a landscape architecture application, is just like any item you're going to specify, define what it is. This is a definition of compost that's widely accepted and accepted by AFCO, that it has to meet a controlled aerobic condition for breakdown, that it's got a thermophilic and a mesophilic temperature phase. We don't need to get into too much of the science of compost. That basically just means a high temperature phase to kill the bad stuff and a low temperature phase to cure and stabilize that material. So we define the product first, and then there's a variety of physical and chemical properties we kind of list for general uses. If you take a look, there's a number of different things Naturcycle and many specifiers would think are important, things like soluble salts, organic matter, the stability. I want to focus a little bit on stability from a composter standpoint, from a use standpoint. You can see the methods down the middle. These are the methods from that STA program that's called the TMECC. We're going to look specifically now at the next page on stability and maturity and just talk about that briefly. So compost stability and maturity is a way to measure how finished the compost it is. Is it ready for use? Is it safe to use in the soil? If something hasn't finished composting, it will finish composting in the soil. So either get the composter or the manufacturer to complete the process and get it stable and ready for use, or if it isn't done on their property, it's going to be done on your property. So a way to measure that the Compost Council has really adopted, and it is widely adopted for soil uses too, is a term called respirometry and a bioassay. They're actually doing a couple of different things. Respirometry is where they're measuring how much carbon dioxide the compost gives off. If it's very active compost, it gives off more carbon dioxide. If it's slowed down and finished the process, it should be less. It's a relative scale, but it's very useful. Things like Solvita measure respirometry, but just with like a color code. So if you haven't seen that, this is what Solvita looks like. There's also bioassays, which are pictured before, which are basically test growing a small plant versus a control in the sample of compost to make sure there's nothing negative from a plant standpoint, an agronomic standpoint in that material. It's a relative control, but it's very helpful just to know if there's any potential negative herbicides or unfinished material. Pictured on the left is Solvita. If you haven't seen it, it's right there with the little color scale. The other setups are more lab-based, a variety of different lab applications for respirometry. They measure the same thing. a finished, stable compost doesn't rob soil of the nutrients. It should grow healthy plants and shouldn't have very many water-soluble nutrients that could leach off. So that's where stability is important. We'll talk about more when we get into low nutrient compost. So back to these general landscape specifications, now that we really delve into stability, particle size is an important one often for this application. What type of material? Compost Council uses just one gradation, 3/8 is like a standard, 3/8 minus. So how much of the compost passes a 3/8 sieve? You know, that you could get more specific depending upon the job, but it's a good standard place to start. A screen material definitely gives you, more options for uses and just ensures that you're getting more of a finished product. Then there's a standard of quality with any design. Just as an example here, we put in the STA standards, which if they're in that program, they're required to test on a regular basis. Even the smallest composter is going to test 3 or 4 times a year. So really there shouldn't be any tests more than 90 or so days old. So some sort of recent analysis. Compost is a living, developing product. So having testing that should be fairly current is important if you're a composter, especially if you're an end user. And if something's not enrolled in the STA program, the great thing is these standards could be tested to. You could send it to one of these labs and do individual or your own package of tests and not technically be in the program per se. So if you just wanted to check the material or do a more basic test, this is the standards. And, as a Compost Council member, we'd love to see more people enroll, but reality, states like New York and other places that require this always allow for tested to the equivalent without enrolling in the program. So if you wanted to just have your material tested, you could also use these standards, compare it to the DOT specs in a state like New York, and then be able to follow through. Next. So some general takeaways and things to think about on these general compost specs, like if you're going to specify compost use in a backfill situation, asking for a physical sample prior to delivery should be doable for any composter, even just a small amount, just to ensure it's the type and quality of compost you're looking for. Keeping in mind from a landscape architecture standpoint, larger loads and bigger amounts tend to have lower costs. Not that that's not obvious, but if you're planning out a project, if you can decide that you're going to use it in a wide application, maybe use some to top dress, some for the backfill, you can come up with better price points for the end user and the customers and your client by figuring out a way to use a little bit more compost. It's great to use 5 or 10 yards on a job, but if you can start using 30, 40, 50, now you're into full tractor trailer size amounts that could really bring the cost down for the end user and expand your compost, compost options. There are creative ways to deliver these materials too if you do have a smaller job. Pictured on the right there is a super sack. A number of composters in the New England area are offering their compost in these crane bags that come on a pallet. So you can bring them to a site and do that 3-4 yard job that way. And something to keep in mind from a landscape architecture standpoint we see quite often is there's an inverse weed pressure with compost use potentially. Because you're improving those soils, the weeds bank that's already there can sometimes develop very quickly. So you want to, if you improve the soil with compost, you want to go quickly into your mulching and planting or overseeding or hydroseeding, because we've seen sites where they go and improve the soil with compost and then leave it bare for a long time, develop a strong weed presence, and then try to say that, oh, the compost might be a source or the soil was a source. Well, really what happens is you've improved the environment, and anything that was there or is blown in or coming into the site is going to quickly want to take off. So when thinking of timing of these sites and of projects and the way you're writing specifications, another thing to potentially talk about is that these things should be done in a stepped process as you're ready to plant, as you're ready to seed, because you can get that inverse weed pressure, that you've made the soil better. Well, whatever's already there is going to take off. Whatever might be blown in over time is going to take off if you're not getting ahead of it with your planting and seeding. So let's talk about how that actually gets done from a spec standpoint. We're glad to share more information after. It's blending these soils into an on or off site application where it could be used as a fill material. If delivered and mixed on the site, potentially, that's kind of pictured on the right, where you've got a stockpile of soil. We don't always need the most technical fancy solutions. improving the soil by blending it with this excavator and moving it and placing it with simple ratios like 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 parts of soil to compost, you can create a fairly consistent product. There's different ways to incorporate, maybe disking or blending in place. And then you're providing a good base of establishment for turf or other vegetation. And keeping in mind, sometimes with the right compost, you can even buffer certain parameters like pH that in the Northeast can be a challenging application. Restoring that soil biology, bringing in the right type of compost can alter soil pH. So looking specifically at that backfill, again, for a design and installer standpoint today, just as a rough idea, you could start with maybe 2 parts soil, 1 part compost, mix them thoroughly, place around trees and shrubs and plants. You can kind of see that, that example pictured here, that you're going to improve fertility and lower bulk density. We do occasionally get the idea that, if you dig out this area, now the roots won't want to leave because, the nutrients all right there. They won't expand outside their area. That's where it's important not to make super clean, smooth, compacted sides to these holes. It's to have some rough area where over time the roots will move out, and to keep the compost application relatively, quote unquote, low to the soil, that 33%, something along those lines, maybe a little bit higher, but you're not doing a backfill around a tree with 100% compost or 90% compost. It's a relatively low by volume calculation. If you look at by mass, it's even lower. So the idea that the root, you get root bound or they'll want to stay in that area, the compost does have a nutrient cycle to it and a time frame, and the tree's much longer in most cases, almost all cases. So, the idea that the tree or something like that won't want to leave the area, I think long term, as they use up the nutrients, mineralize what they want, it's going to continue to grow. It's a highly successful application, widely used, and we just want to focus on this one a little bit today. So when are we applying these materials? Most times of year, these are useful ways to mend or blend soils. I avoid winter and super wet conditions. Wet doesn't allow often for good soil blending, but too dry can also be a challenge. Just becomes dusty and doesn't incorporate well. So there is not technically a Goldilocks scenario for this, but trying to avoid certain extremes is useful. And then remembering from a design standpoint that testing and these reports can take time, and accounting for this in the timeline or noting it in the design is important. That something like the STA package at a lab can take 2 to 3 full weeks with that bioassay. That takes time for them to test grow the plants versus the control. It's at least a 2-week time frame. So there's not rushing some of these agronomic and other important compost tests when we go to actually use the material. One of my personal expertises, and that Naturcycle spends a lot of time on, and I just wanted to touch upon briefly, since we're focusing on landscape architects today, is green roof media. If you're not familiar with this, it's another stormwater management tool. It's a soil-less media, meaning it has almost no silt and clay. Anything that has no silt and clay is not considered a soil. Almost no silt and clay. If it doesn't fall within the USDA chart, below a few percentage points, less than 10 total of sand, complete silt and clay, it's just sand in theory. So this is creating a soil using very little silt and clay. It's usually based around some sort of expanded lightweight material. If you're not familiar with those, shale or pumice or expanded clay out of the South, shale's made here in the Northeast in Albany and Kingston, New York. And then compost is the critical aspect of this. We wouldn't be successful in these projects without really well-made, stable, finished compost. Pictured on the left is just one of our yards where there's some green roof media. It kind of has a soil-like look. In the middle is a common profile and how these things get built up with a drainage layer. You'll see the roof, then you'll see a drainage layer, and then the soil and plants. Just to kind of show you what that profile looks like. In the far right is a seed of mat installation we did last year in Poughkeepsie, a big hospital. You can kind of see what you can accomplish with these materials these days, regulating the weight and coming up with something that holds a lot of stormwater on site. But I wouldn't be able to do this, and it wouldn't be nearly as successful without things like well-made compost. And we carry the spec over from the compost into the soil design as well. So if I design a soil media for this, we carry that compost spec into the soil design to assure quality. So since our brief detour, let's get back into landscape uses with top dressing with compost. If you're not familiar, this is a way, top dressing is going to refer to established plants. So you're not planting something new, it's already in place. It could be a tree or shrub, it could be a perennial, an annual, sorry, I'm not a big plant guy. Or in this example, here's a turf grass. So you're applying a thin layer of, it tends to be a bit richer, fine compost on top of existing soil. It tends to get used on athletic fields, golf courses. We even see expansion of use on home or commercial turf stands, like an office park where they don't want to use chemicals. If you don't want True Green coming out there, et cetera, sorry to call out some of my name, a chemical applicator, you can apply a thin layer of compost and get a lot of those soil benefits. It really requires the right compost, the right design parameters for that compost, and then the right equipment for application to get the best results. So pictured on the right is a Turfco top dresser. It could do sand or compost, just trying to show an example of what that actual application looks like. So here's our spec for top dressing with compost. We talk about what the compost additions for soils benefit, and then we talk about how to do it. So I just want to spend a minute here talking about exactly how to specify this, because if you're a landscape architect and you've got schools you deal with or coming up with that final package or existing tans of turf, this is a great spec to use. You know, should be common, very common out there these days. There's more and more applicators. You're going to apply a 1/4 to a 1/2 inch screen compost application rate, you know, a thin amount on top evenly over the surface. After some passes, you should aerify or some way. There's different types of aerification. If you're not familiar with that is, you're punching holes in turf, if we're doing turf in particular, to open that soil back up with different applications. Sometimes they pull cores, if you haven't heard that term, and then you're going to smooth or drag the area somehow. If desired, you can seed again and then mow. Watering is also important where possible and recommended to help work that compost into the ground. Compost sitting on top is dark in color. So sometimes if in the summertime or a very warm time of year, you can burn the tops of turf because it's high organic matter compost on top of this living plant. It won't hurt the plant long term. It tends to bounce back once it cools off. Most of our turf species are cool season grasses in the Northeast, so it bounces back very well, but you could get some visual impact that might not be as popular. This tends to be a spring or fall thing, even late fall into almost winter. You can overwinter these fields with the compost without issue. So at the very end of the season, when that ground first starts getting hard, a great time to potentially do compost applications. So continuing with that spec, you know, we look for STA participants or something that, you know, tested out equally for states like Vermont, if there aren't many currently, and then some of the ranges to look for, you know, fairly low soluble salts, high organic matter, a very fine material. You can usually use a well-made 3/8 material because this is, don't forget, passing that sieve. So most of the material is finer than that. With a good mow or drag out, any larger pieces that might be of concern tend to break up very easily. If something's well composted, even if it looks a little big like a piece of mulch, you should be able to break it in your hands. Finished composted material, the carbon gets eaten up by the bacteria and the fungi, or mostly eaten up. So it breaks down woodier materials. If you can take something out of a compost pile and it's very hard to break, or it doesn't want to break at all, potentially it's not totally finished compost. That's just a rule of thumb. I wouldn't consider it 100% takeaway, but well-made compost, most of the pieces, if there is even a larger amount, should crumble some under, you know, a severe pressure, like you trying to bend it in half. And this is where that stability once again comes in, like maturity and respirometry, some measure of how finished that is. Another important thing to look for is that you want a really finished, stable compost when using on top of turf. An unstable material will rob the turf of nutrients as it finishes breaking down. So here's some ways to how to top dress, you know, directly by the installer, different subcontractors. There's turf applicators like Andre and Sons. There's a couple of New Hampshire turf applicators that go in and just do turf, different solutions. I mean, they're using an actual, you know, manure type spreader here with low impact tires to really spread this material. Different blower truck companies. some sort of evenly, natural level of application where you're not having big clumps or lumps or high levels of compost that could bury the turf. You want to be able to see the stand of turf at the end when you're done. So that's kind of a way to judge. Just very quickly, some application rates from a landscape architecture standpoint, designing specs and bids. Pictured on the bottom right is a real simple way just to calculate your application rate, where if you want to use that manure spreader or a different type of equipment, I'm measuring out a large piece of cardboard, a couple feet by a couple feet, passing the machine over the top of it, then collecting that material into a 5-gallon bucket. You can calculate out the application rate. As long as you know the measure of that piece of cardboard you put out there, you can calculate back how much is being applied. I can get into that more later, but just saying there are ways to calibrate even the simplest application. Because once you know the square footage, we can back into how much it weighs. If we know how much it weighs, we can calculate out the application rate. Roughly for an acre of application, a 1/4 inch, a very thin application, is about 33 cubic yards. That 1/4 to 1/2 inch, so about 60, 65 yards, is a common application for an acre of field. A full-size soccer field in all the areas is roughly an acre by the time you're done. Baseball fields, it's about 2 per acre. So there's different ways you can, package these materials together, package these projects together, and potentially, use more material to help bring the individual cost down. Back quickly to timing for top dressing tends to be late fall, early winter in the Northeast. You really want to avoid over compacting the soils. This isn't the place where the farm tractor is traditionally going to go out. It's going to be some sort of tractor or mower designed for low impact. You don't want to compact the materials while you're doing this. Tends to be one where you're going to want the material delivered just prior to use. Having the compost sit outside, it tends to be very good at sucking up moisture. So if you got it 2 weeks before you need it and you get a couple of rainstorms, even tarped, it could be hard to keep it easy to use and dry for spreading. This is one where, from a sourcing standpoint, just keep in mind it could be a longer lead time. It tends to be a more specialized compost size, but there are a number of producers very capable of making it in Vermont, the Lake Champlain Basin. I would just keep in mind that sourcing this might take a little bit longer than just getting a compost for backfill would potentially. From an operation and maintenance standpoint, again, from a landscape architecture standpoint, on a truly sand-based field, you really can't apply compost every year. You need to keep a balance of the organic matter to the minerals in the field. You don't want to overdo it. So top dressing with compost in those applications where it's not a native soil field might be an every other year type application, doing some sand just to keep that balance accurate. You can over accumulate organic matter in soils. Once you get above 10% in the soil profile, you can have excess water holding, more anaerobic type conditions. That'd be quite hard to achieve. I don't see too many athletic fields or commercial stands of turf or anywhere near that application because of compaction. As you compact soils, that's a big enemy to organic matter. So if you use the athletic field a lot, it's hard to accumulate excess organic matter. So it's kind of a combination here that I'm putting out the warning because we're expanding these uses, but the practical application is this is tough to do. It might be more common on a home or residential application where the turf isn't really getting that much active use. So we keep it in mind, but in a high use situation, athletic fields, parks, event spaces, as people tread on that soil, that reduces the organic matter. And then I would also keep in mind, you reduce your fertilizer applications if you're going to use compost. Start with a soil analysis, look where you're at for an NPK standpoint, and then decide with the NPK of the compost what I may or may not need. Another one where you could overdo it very quickly, cause potential runoff issues. If you're going to switch to using compost natural solutions, keep that in mind for your fertilizer application or program. So just a brief example, just to kind of show you what these things look like as we're going along, how simple this can be even at a small scale. Instead of bringing in new soil, you're using a well-made compost to help encourage that turf to fill in. Here's just a residential picture example, just to show you what can be accomplished from literally the same spot and nothing but compost and a little bit of seed. Again, some turf repair examples just for again, educational purposes to see what you can, and they use nothing in these two examples, thanks to a picture from AgriSource and their resources today. It wanted to get something specifically in the Northeast. I think this is in New Hampshire. You can see specifically the success you can have. So one thing I want to talk about from a compost producer standpoint, and a number of compost producers in the basin have, is a compost-based mulch product, where you're replacing your traditional mulch specs with a composted base mulch, where it could be a blend of wood mulches and finished compost, or it could be the overs, what we call the overs from a compost process. If you're going to screen material, you often end up with coarser residuals you can use later. And then what you do is that material can release a little bit of nutrient back into the soil as it continues to break down, and it protects soil better from rainfall impact because it's better absorbing water than traditional wood-based mulches are. So compost versus all wood mulch, uncomposted carbon materials want to break down, so they rob the soil of nutrients as they break down. That's what the whole carbon process is. Composting process is. It's part of the carbon cycle. So you start with a high carbon to nitrogen ratio, a lot of carbon, a little nitrogen, and then as that nitrogen and the bacteria that are out there in the world and fungi break down that carbon, you get a more stable finished material. Carbon wants to get used up in our environment. So if you put uncomposted material like wood chip on top of the soil, the bacteria and fungi in the soil and other bad things will attack that carbon and break it down. If I blend in some compost, I can reduce that pressure for those bacteria and microbes to go after it, and I can have a longer lasting, mulch type product. It also darkens up mulch quite often in a number of compost and mulch producers because it ends up getting that finished brown look. Gets blended into a number of natural compost products. A common one is something called sweet peat. If you've seen that term, it's really a compost product that they market as a mulch. Not to give away anything on their part, but it's basically a blend of materials that get composted and then marketed as a mulch. So some of the summary of the benefits here from the compost use in the landscape and top dressing applications, or something like a green roof or fill application. You're going to get improved long-term performance. It's a much more sustainable approach. Fertilizer is a huge CO2 pollutant in its production. There's a more slow release nutrient aspect to compost because the nutrients in compost are often in organic forms. Organic is in chemistry, not organic is in whole foods. So the type of nutrients available need to be converted by bacteria and fungi in the soil to make them plant available, which is a normal part of the process. It's not a good or bad thing. They're just not as much of it is instantly available. And then you're using local materials here to support organic diversion and your local compost producers. I mean, fertilizer, there's no fertilizer production facility in the Northeast. The South has a number of them, but they're not produced here. Local compost is truly a local, sustainable, recyclable material. We could see more uses in our variety of landscape and DOT applications. So now that we kind of looked at landscape application, best management practices, and the actual specs and the uses, we're going to dig into some direct erosion control applications. If you've never seen one, on the left is like a blower truck slope stabilization application using compost, where it's a coarse material put on the front for stormwater management. So why we do this, very briefly, top right, what the natural environment looks like. Most of the water that falls from the sky, rain or snow, either evapotranspirates, meaning plants use it, or it infiltrates. 80, 90% never leaves the area. Our built up, more urban, suburban environments, the majority tends to run off. So we use compost to try to recreate that first environment. We're using more things to mimic nature. So in Vermont in particular, there's a variety of erosion and sediment control specifications and programs already in place. And what they require for post-construction soil amendment is that the disturbed soil has to be restored to at least 4% organic matter, meaning compost is usually the best solution for this because compost is a key source of organic matter. Municipal roads and general permits for a construction site are going to require the reduction of that runoff and excess sediment, and then some sort of stabilization plan. So this is a very Vermont specific slide, but kind of talks about what's in the Vermont stormwater permits, and you should keep in mind from a design standpoint. So that road construction remediation from erosion control standpoint is if you're going to cut or cut into a hillside or road bank, you're going to use compost as the stabilization solution. It could be added to the topsoil to speed revegetation. It could be used on the surface as like a blanket for a temporary mulching application prior to revegetation. It also increases the capacity of the soil itself to infiltrate and retain moisture. And VTrans has used this in a number of trials, and it's very common in the Southwest and the Southeast. Places like California and Texas use millions of yards of compost for compost blanket applications annually as their preferred method of slope stabilization. This is that direct erosion control practice. You've got erosion control blankets, compost berms, and filter sock, where the compost itself is the stormwater solution. It's not mixed with soil. It's the finished compost product that becomes the useful application. So we're going to look at these BMPs. There's really two, blanket and berm, and then a filter sock is used with a membrane, some sort of sock, or, as you can see, like a tube looking thing that becomes a silt fence alternative or a ditch check, and we'll get more into that. So compost-based blankets and berms can be used for pollution removal. This is a specific AASHTO, American Society of Highway Transportation Officials spec that we're going to look at. It's called MP9, MP10, publicly available. It needs to be a coarser compost, pictured in the bottom right, more mulch-like, what they call the middles of a compost screen, with a lower percentage passing the 1/4 inch. So if you have not seen, this is a technical drawing of that. This is how it gets applied. There's some sort of berm at both ends or compost sock to prevent water getting underneath it, and then a thick layer applied like a blanket on the slope, literally like it says. So what's important and why the compost blanket has advantages over artificial methods, and this is really what this picture demonstrates as a cutaway here, is that the compost offers 100% soil contact. You can see in the top picture that is an undulating soil surface and a profile. The compost meets it at 100%, right? Correct? You can see it visually attaches itself and physically in the visual example. Below is a common, artificial solution for erosion control. That method doesn't actually come much into contact with the soil. It leaves bare spots. It's not physically touching the soil quite often. It's trying to create something similar to what you create with the compost, where it breaks up the stormwater, gives the plant turf, quite often grasses, a chance to establish, but it doesn't get a true 100% contact like a compost does. So that's why this blanket application becomes so popular, is that 100% soil contact. So let's look at this is the actual AASHTO spec. It talks about there's two types. If you're going to vegetate the compost, meaning add seed to it or spray on top with hydroseed, and then unvegetated. We'll really focus on the vegetated. That's the most common application and what we see in the Northeast, where you're going to apply this compost, mix seed in as they're applying it, or hydroseed over the top. It's got where there's things measured like the moisture content, the organic content, has to have some level of organic matter to get the plants established, and then it shows the preferred gradations. This is a bit more complicated gradation, so you're going to have a screened material to really achieve this. An unscreened can't kind of create this consistent result. And then there's that stability measure that the compost is finished and ready for use. And they even have a standard for, man-made inerts, other material that might be there that you don't want, like plastic or glass. So this is the actual application rates that, as the designer, you need to look at. You look at your rainfall erosivity index. We'll look at that next. And it tells you how much compost to apply for that rainfall area and that type of slope. We'll get more into it in a second here. So if you're not, so we'll go down to the next. This is the continued spec. It's a fairly long spec. Erosion control blanket, to be successful, is a fairly detailed long spec. But part of what you're going to need to use is go to the rainfall erosivity index and put in your actual physical project location, and it will give you a number you can plug into the specification. Here's an example in Vermont of 5.9. I looked up a number of places in Vermont. They're all around 5 or 6. It's a common, northeast type range based upon the amount of storms and types of storms we get, and then the slope of the area, the common, soil conditions in the area. It's not specific to your job in that sense, but it's general USDA research. We can go back one.
Yep.
So again, this is a long spec. Glad to share it. Got a couple versions, but to be successful, you're really blanketing the hillside. You're enveloping it. You're going above the disturbed area. So if we've made a cut into a hillside on a commercial or roadside project or a DOT, your compost doesn't just stop where the disturbed soil is. It needs to go up and over to prevent water getting behind it as well, which is important to success. So slopes with soil, uncomposted, water tends to roll downhill, speed and mass tends to increase that erosion. Rills are formed. Once you get a rill, you get more erosion. It's just a building series of problems. The compost is a flat, flexible material. It knits together on the slope. It's softer and won't roll in that sense. It holds itself in place by its natural porous, nature. That's why you need that coarser material, and it'll allow water to as the water hits it, it slows it down and then allows it to slowly infiltrate into that soil below. Different ways to apply a compost blanket. You can spread it with a dozer over moderate slopes, as long as you're keeping compaction in mind. Slinger trucks, blower trucks, all kinds of different applications, anything that you can do to lightly apply it, even a bucket application with a loader or a long reach excavator where you can lightly place the material, anything to get it in place without over compacting the slope or area. Pictured as a blower truck, just kind of showing you how that tends to look, but a real even high level application. Again, different applications. That's a remote slinger that's become very popular, where all it does is sling. There's that erosion control application, again, where they're blowing it onto the hillside for a DOT job. This is what a compost berm looks like. It's often tied into the blanket application, so this helps prevent the water from getting behind the blanket. Here's an example from Windham Solid Waste right in Vermont, where they bermed part of the area to prevent erosion. Very simple. Once you're done with the project, you can spread the material back out, even potentially, and revegetate that area. So the berm ties back to the blanket. Here's the berm specifications. If you're designing that hillside slope, it ties back to that rainfall erosivity index. It gives you the dimensions that the berm should be and how to construct it. Very briefly, the geometry here versus other applications. The reason the berm is successful: three-dimensional filter. Even as a sediment accumulates up against it, water's going to hit it, and water by gravity wants to go down, so it moves through these berm triangle types situations down and through versus directly across. Just an example of a berm application instead of, say, a silt fence. Another alternative to that, and a direct corrosion control use, is a compost filter sock. This gets filled with a very coarse, almost mulch-like material with no fines. Pictured on the left is what carbon woody materials look like after they get composted. The biology breaks down that carbon material, eats it, and converts it into its energy, and leaves behind these little air spaces that are good at sucking up water, lighten up the material, provide a number of different benefits. So that material pictured on the left is what it, and then physically looks like the one in the middle and goes into the sock on the right. Again, back to that three-dimensional geography. Even as silt potentially builds up behind it, because it's a three-dimensional filter, the water goes through it slowly, slows down, moves across the surfaces and down and through versus hitting it like a dam. Just if you haven't seen them, a silt fence versus a filter sock. This is the type of failures that are common in silt fence. Once they accumulate too much sediment, they can't handle the weight behind them because they're just not designed to hold an infinite amount of weight, and they tend to fail. And in this scenario, it's failed, poorly, very badly, and you're getting a lot of runoff. Here, just to quickly think about this from a visual standpoint, this is how a silt fence operates. If it's even properly installed, you're putting it below the grade partially with that fabric, staking it out, and then you're creating a wall that hopefully will stop the water. Next. What tends to happen is that it can't sustain the force of water and sediment flow over time and then fails. Initially, it obviously works, but as it builds up sediment, if it's not removed in a timely fashion or the project takes longer or the sediment calculation is off and there's just more material running off the site than planned, the silt fence can't hold up to that type of pressure over time. So here's again just some filter sock examples I've dealt with over the years in Pennsylvania. You can kind of see how clean that turf is. That concrete is next to that soil pile, even though it's been out there a while, that had been out there a few months even, and it's doing its job preventing that particulate from leaving the site. Even pictured on the right, yes, it's holding back the water and doing what it's supposed to, and you can see that overall it's fairly clean on the other side. You can look at the sidewalk next to it. There's no giant dirt pile or anything like there might be in other applications. This one is staked just to give you some extra protection. You could stake filter sock or not. So here's the combination example I was talking about, where you can use a little bit of both. If you got a really steep slope, the socks help potential water from running down or behind the material. If you don't have room to really envelop the hillside, you can use the sock as an extra level of protection, like pictured on the left. Some examples in New York, in Vermont, this is actually some palletized material, which is becoming more and more available. You can buy pallets of socks filled and ready to go to use in place of silt fence. A number of distributors sell them, and here's an example from a parking lot installation in Vermont. You know, as their instead of a silt fence, they installed this material. Here's that palletized example. You can see the picture of a truck installing it manually, where they've actually blow the material right into the sock along bigger job sites. Companies like E.J. Prescott that distribute pipe and stormwater tools also sell sock. Brand names like Filtrex. There's all kinds of different ways to get these socks options in 2021. So operation and maintenance, we're going to briefly look at. You know, it's a little bit lead time longer. It's something that tends to get designed in up front. If it's a berm, my recommendation tends to be to hydroseed over it for the best results. You're getting the combination of the best of both worlds, the quick establishment of the hydroseeding with the stronger soil contact and nutrient providing of the compost. So the combination gets a really, successful result. Some detailed resources if you want to look at later. If you're really into this, Caltrans, the California Department of Transportation, has a 3-hour webinar just literally almost focusing on stormwater applications of compost related to compost blankets. A heck of a lot of it is focused on blanket application. Very educational. It's about 3.5 hours. So long time. And some other places to look for additional resources. So let's spend a little bit of time here as we're getting long, as I tend to be long-winded. My wife and family will attend to. We got low nutrient applications, which are very important for watershed areas like the Lake Champlain Basin and for designers throughout the Northeast. How do we prevent and ensure we're not going to have phosphorus or even nitrogen runoff from our composts or soil amendments that we're going to be using? Let's dig into that a little bit more. So these are low nutrient applications where it could be used around water bodies. So maybe if we want to ensure the compost blanket near a sensitive water body doesn't have a high level of nutrients that could run off, there's ways to measure that. This is back to that testing and measurement type thing. And then to demonstrate that it could be useful to amend a bioretention. So if we have a bioretention or a wetland application, how do we ensure the compost isn't going to be a negative source of nutrients? There is a method to test for this. So the key we're going to look at today is phosphorus. It's a nutrient of concern in compost. How phosphorus moves off site quite often is more attached to the soil particle than actually dissolving in rainwater or stormwater. Same thing, sorry. But phosphorus doesn't often dissolve in water that easily. It tends to be carried off site by the physical particles. That's where the things like the filter socks and the blankets are important. They prevent that soil particle from moving. Where you could see that failed silt fence, all that darkness to the water, that brownness is the physical soil particle in there. So the dissolved phosphorus in the water there isn't much dissolved physically in the water. It's mostly carried away by that soil particle that once it gets into the water body, drops to the bottom of that water body, goes aerobic and releases all that phosphorus. So there's your algal blooms in 30 seconds. And a healthy soil can hold much more water than an unhealthy soil in the sense that it's got the right level of organic matter, open airspace, things like that. So using compost is critical to success, but some places do get concerned about the potential runoff, nutrient leaching you could have using compost, and we're going to address that by a testing methodology. So Vermont has some media designed around testing, what they call the saturated media method for extraction to measure the level of phosphorus. Penn State has a manure-based testing model that they developed that's very useful, that actually measures what's truly available for the P in a compost, by P meaning phosphorus in this case. So, the saturated media test, it was designed for greenhouse medias like potting media, like you grow plants in for commercial sale, where what Penn State developed is used on manures, which is very useful because then they knew what the farmer is actually applying to the field and how much of that P is actually available, meaning how much is water soluble, how much could leave the field. So it's a much more useful, at least in Naturcycle's opinion, measurement to use. So a quick look at this, what they call total P versus water extractable P. Something like a saturated media extraction kind of develops the total P of the material because they're using acid to extract that P from the soil, from the compost. If you look at the total P of a compost, it could be a couple percentage points. In this case, some are even high as 5 or 6% of the material by mass. But if you look at the water extractable P that actually could come out in a rainfall event or just by using water to try to extract it, you get a very low percentage of that. So you can see those are fractional numbers of the total. And that's what that water extractable test will tell you and verify and give the designer and the client and the regulators a high level of comfort that you've got a material that isn't going to be leaching phosphorus back out into the environment. So if we're going to design a low nutrient compost, Naturcycle has developed a spec for that. We've shared with the soil builders. That's available for everyone's use. Low levels of total P, which is good to know because it's a good place to start. Certain pH ranges are important to ensure you don't have initial runoff. And then maturity and stability are very important because a finished material has a much lower runoff potential than an unfinished compost. That maturity is really important. That's where once it's stable and finished, that process overall, most of the nutrients stabilize and are less water soluble. They're more in organic forms that are less potential to run off. So our recommended levels are, that's that methodology there based on a ppm. It might seem fairly high, but that was the same methodology used for those previous numbers where we see a fractional amount actually available. This is the method. It's very long. Hopefully they'll have a shorter ASTM version soon, but they're working towards it. You can kind of see now we have a way to test the material to ensure we're not going to have phosphorus runoff. So how that gets used is you could then use that compost specification to say you need to mix a compost that meets these specs into a soil if you're going to use it in a stormwater application like this. So you need to ensure the compost isn't going to be a source of phosphorus. You use that spec as step one, and then you say, here's the soil mix or amending in places we want to. So where that could get used is in a bioretention soil or wetland mix. It becomes part of the specification for even erosion control in sensitive water areas. It could be an additional line you add back into the design. And since it's a testing-based verification, you could even write in that you want it on the batch of compost to be used or something very specific to ensure the material actually coming to your site is tested. This is verified to have a low P potential. So testing existing sources might be a good way to look at this. Some compost, like heavily maced ones, might not be a good fit for this. Things like chicken litter or heavily cow manure-based compost, meaning most of the compost is made from cow manure, might not be a great fit for low nutrient applications. Things that have larger amounts of wood or carbon in there are a good place to start and look for if you're examining different materials. And unstable or unfinished compost tend to be higher potential for water-soluble nutrients. So operation and maintenance considerations, if you're a designer or an installer later, there are some designs that go with almost no organic matter. To me, that's going to be a long-term performance issue. Plants need something to get started in these systems. If you start and try to make a no organic matter bioretention or extremely low, like 1% organic matter, you could have some struggle for plant establishment. If the plants don't get established, the whole system breaks down. Long-term, it's really about supporting the best plant health and plant growth, because they're what's actually going to use up the water and then continue to keep the soil open so it infiltrates. So plant health is important, good plant health up front, a little bit more organic matter, better long-term performance. In-place nutrient testing is also available, trying to avoid invasive species, so well-made compost in a good process, and then some sort of annual mowing and trimming. Maintenance is important in these bioinfiltration type applications. So I've thrown a lot at you today, but I appreciate everyone's time. We're going to be able to, after this, relate the 4 segments of compost use we talked about, which is landscape applications and fill applications. We didn't discuss agriculture, low nutrient, and direct erosion control applications. We talked about how to actually define compost applications for backfill. We went over specific tests and designs of a spec for a low nutrient compost use. And we talked about a couple benefits, that compost has physical, biological, and chemical benefits they offer soil, which is, some of the keys you can get from Topdressing. So if anyone has the need for LACES credits, please send Natasha an email directly after with your LACES number, and we can, make sure you get your certificate and get it entered into the system. Today's course was registered under NC 101 on the system. So if anyone needs those credits, they are available. And I'm glad to take questions when Natasha summarizes what we need to.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks, Chuck, and thanks, everybody. I know a couple people dropped off as we hit the hour. If you do have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box. I think Chuck can stay on for another few minutes to address anything that might have come up. I don't see anything yet, but just again, we do need your LACES or your LACE number in order to approve the credit. So go ahead and send that to me and I'll coordinate with Chuck. We are going to be sending around an evaluation as well. After this, you'll receive that by email. So please go ahead and fill that out. That helps us. And let's see, we do have a question that came in from Deborah saying, for the filter socks, do these typically get removed after use?
In theory, you can cut open the fabric or plastic, sock itself and just spread out the material if it's going to be in a vegetated area. So they're removed in a sense, but they tend to be less removal than, say, a silt fence, at least in my opinion. Because you can just split the top of the sock, rake it out, and pull the sock out when you're done. There are biodegradable socks, but that puts you on a real tight time frame, and we all know how construction goes. So there are biodegradable options out there, but you have to be very confident of your project time frame, I will call it.
Yep. And we just, for those who may not have been able to join the Vermont Organics Recycling Summit the first week in May, we had a soil builders session as part of the summit as well, and talked a bit about removal, but also some of the issues with silt fence is supposed to be removed as well, often isn't, but when it is, that plastic will also degrade and break down and can actually be much more difficult to remove because it's in little pieces of plastic as opposed to some of the sock materials. Any other questions from anybody?
I'm glad to, if anyone has a more detailed question or wants anything particular, please email Natasha. We're glad to follow up and give more specific answers later.
Yeah. So Deb says that she's conducting research into this area and would like to follow up. So yeah, Deb, you have my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me directly and I can connect you into this whole project where we're providing a lot of information and links to resources. There are handful of the soil builder sessions already up on the Composting Association of Vermont's website under compostingvermont.org/soil builders. I will be getting the session from the summit up soon, and this one will be posted hopefully next week as well. So keep an eye on that. And then we will be rolling out more deep dive sessions into specific aspects of compost use. So we hope you can join us for the rest of the program. Thanks everybody so much for taking time out of your day. And thanks, Chuck, as always, for sharing your expertise and experience with us.
Thank you everyone for your time.
Appreciate it. All right. Take care, everybody.